This is Dan Schneider, and this is American Television with Mitchell Hadley. That's Mitchell Hadley, and this is our second show of the day. We are going to be talking about Henry Morgan. And we're not talking about the guy who was on MASH or was on Dragnet or anything. We're talking about a guy who you probably don't know, so that's why we're doing this show. Before we do, for those who don't know Mitch, can you just give a little background on who you are?
I am a classic TV historian. I write about it at the website itsabouttv.com, about television and its relationship with American history and American pop culture. I'm the author of two books about classic television. My most recent is called Darkness in Prime Time, and it talks about the descent into hell of our culture over the last 30 or 40 years and how it was prophesized by the classic TV era. I've also written two novels. I have a third novel coming out in June, which I'm really excited about. So I'm just sitting here typing my fingers to the bone.
All right, so Henry Morgan, I mentioned MASH, and there's an actor named Harry Morgan, but interestingly enough, Harry Morgan was originally known as Henry Morgan back in the 1940s. I remember a great sort of noir western from the late 40s with Gregory Peck, and Harry Morgan was in it, called Yellow Sky. You should watch that film if you've never heard of it nor seen it. But then in later years, I guess there might have been some kind of dust up between the guy who became Harry Morgan, Sherman Potter on MASH, and Henry Morgan the humorist that we're going to talk about. And I guess that Henry Morgan the humorist won the rights to the name because Henry Morgan, the actor, later became Harry Morgan. So before we actually talk about Henry Morgan, do you know anything about the story or the kerfuffle between the two Morgans?
I don't, although it would not surprise me given Henry Morgan's propensity to be a kind of a prickly personality. I do know that at some point in time, Screen Actors Guild, and I'm assuming that they were both members,
Yeah.
came through with the kinds of guidelines where you could not have two people who had the same name, which is why you have some people. Famously, David Bowie, for example, his birth name is David Jones. And he couldn't use that because there was already a Davy Jones on Monkeys, and he had first claim to the name. So it could be that it had something to do with that. That's why you see so many actors using their middle initials,
Yeah.
like Robert Wagner when he writes a book. But if there was a kerfluffle, I'm not a bit surprised.
And interestingly, just looking at Harry Morgan, he was born Harry Bratsburg, whereas Henry Morgan was born as Henry von Ost. So neither of them were Henry Morgans in actuality. So let's.
Well, I am proud to say that I am, as far as I know, the one and only Mitchell Hadley. So I've never had to fight anybody for that name.
So let's talk about Henry Morgan, née Van Ost Jr. Who was he? Where did he come from?
He was the short bio bit out of the way. He was born in New York City in 1915. He grew up in the Bronx. He came of an era of radio. Again, not surprising how we always talk about this, but he didn't come through radio in the way that so many of the people that we talk about do. He actually came in not through the broadcasting side, but through the technical side. He enjoyed playing with radios, had a lifelong interest in mechanics and technology and things like that. And so he came into radio primarily through that. He built his own radios. He became adept at working with studios, with their transmissions, their mechanics. He wound up working behind the scenes, working as an engineer, doing the control room, and eventually getting into announcing. And so it was his career as an announcer that spawned his career in radio and later on into television. The reason we're talking about him is primarily because of his striking personality on the radio, which later moved on to TV, and about how during his career he kind of created a particular type of personality in his interactions with commercials, in the way that he interacted with the audience, and most importantly, I think the way he interacted with sponsors and with the whole concept of radio and television as a form of entertainment. In that sense, he was one of the first entertainers to really try and pull back the curtain so that you could see things the way they really are. And he understood that the viewers, listeners were not stupid. He wasn't going to treat them that way. And if that meant that he was going to be more blunt than you might expect about the realities of how things worked, that's the way it was going to be. That's, I think, why, as a humorist, as a satirist, as a writer, as someone who appeared on a lot of the panel shows throughout the years and hosted his own shows, particularly on radio. That's what becomes significant about him, and that's why we're talking about him now. At the time, he was quite well known. He and Bill Cullen and Gary Moore are actually three of my favorite personalities from that era, and so that's why he's important.
So one of my favorite comedies of all time is Woody Allen's Radio Days, which deals with the 30s, 40s, 50s in New York during the heyday of New York, and game shows and radio shows and interview shows of that era. And one of the things that was a staple across the dial in New York when I was growing up was still some remnants of that era, where you had what you would call the old rich, the old aristocracy, who had shows that would be talking about going to, the Copacabana and seeing, Bogey and Bacall there. And with a name like Henry Van Ost, and growing up in Washington Heights, Manhattan, he must have come from old money, did he?
I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about his background in that sense. He went to public school. He didn't go to a private schools of any kind, which tends to mitigate against the idea that he would have come from a privileged background. He was very, very bright, very intelligent, well spoken, and represented himself well. So he certainly gives the impression of having had that kind of background, or at least it would have been plausible. But I don't know a lot, and he did not talk a lot about his early years.
So in his early years in radio, it seemed he did really a good cross section of shows. He hosted some shows. He was involved in some, I guess we call variety type shows. He even won a Peabody Award in 1946 for the Henry Morgan Show. So he was, of all the people that we've talked about coming from radio, he might have been the biggest radio name that successfully moved over to television, with the possible exception of Lucille Ball.
Yeah, Morgan had a very successful radio career, but as we're going to find out, it came with a lot of, I don't want to say pitfalls, but you'll see what I mean. It was the very thing which made him successful in radio that to a certain extent mitigated against him becoming more successful in television. And what it was a combination of things. Morgan had a cynical side to him, and he also had a very realistic side. He didn't suffer fools well. He didn't talk down to his audience. He saw through a lot of the bluster that would go on behind the scenes. And what this started to come out with most famously was that his satire. And that's what, Here's Morgan was very much of a satiric type of show. It defined his comedy. And what he would do, as some radio hosts were already doing, he broke the fourth wall. He would talk directly to the listeners. He would comment on the show as it was going on. He might make a joke about the quality of the script that they were working off of, or the skits that they were doing. He would make fun of the format. There was no pretension about that kind of thing. What made him most notorious, though, was the way he would do commercials and the way he would handle his sponsors. Um, Back in those days, and even well into the Tonight Show era and the Today Show era, the stars were expected to do commercials. They were expected to shill for the sponsor because there was a very tight relationship between the sponsor and the program itself. That's where the money came from. Oftentimes that's where the time slot came from. And as you had asked in the earlier show about Bill Kahn, when you asked if he had what kind of a relationship he had with sponsors, it was really important for the host to have that kind of a relationship with a sponsor. He may have even recruited the sponsor to back the show. So that's a kind of a preliminary as to what the traditional relationship between host and sponsor was. This was not how Morgan did the show, though. And I'm going to give you an example of it, an actual example of one of the commercials he did for one of his sponsors. I'm going to try to do my best Morgan impression here, not necessarily of his voice, but the way he's doing this. So he's going off for a commercial. And what he says is this, and now a word from our sponsor. This is the part where I'm supposed to tell you to buy the product. I don't know whether you should buy it or not. That's your problem. But they're paying for the time, so here it is. They make a coffee. It's called, well, you've heard the name all evening, so I'm not going to insult your intelligence by repeating it. But they say it's the finest coffee you can buy. Well, of course, they would say that. If they didn't think so, it would be a very odd business. You're supposed to notice the rich aroma. I haven't, but then I don't have this kind of nose that they hired to write this. Still, if you like coffee, and many people do, you might try it. It is, after all, coffee. And now, having satisfied the contractual obligation, we return to the program. So that's a typical Henry Morgan commercial. And he did a lot of them like that, that were even more tart than that, where he might even ridicule the product. He might even say, I don't know why you want a product like this. I don't know why you need it. But apparently there are people out there who do. And if you do, this is a product you might want to consider. I don't use it, so I don't know how good it is. That you're going to have to find out. That's typical Morgan shtick. Now, of course, this was terrible, a terrible business practice if you're looking at getting ahead. Morgan didn't care because he didn't play by their rules. But sponsors would cancel their commercials. The network would move his shows to different time slots, or they'd be forced to cancel it altogether because they couldn't find sponsors. And from a business standpoint, he developed a reputation for being a really difficult guy to work with. And once you get that kind of a reputation, you're going to find that it's very difficult to really succeed on a consistent basis. Now, what saved Morgan in all of this was the audience. The audience loved this kind of a commercial. What he was doing was he was demonstrating to them the very artificiality of advertising. He was telling them, like, that this commercial, that this is stupid. I know that it's stupid. I'm not going to play around with it. You know what I'm dealing with. So they liked that. Yet they also liked the fact that he treated them as smart people. I'm not going to try to con you on this. I'm telling you what they've written about the product. If you're interested in it, go give it a try. And it was a kind of satire that was new to the medium, quite frankly. You didn't, aside from somebody like Fred Allen on his own TV show, radio show, you didn't have a lot of that kind of satire. Whereas somebody later on, like Ernie Kovacs, would kind of mock the conventions of TV in showing how you could violate them and still be interesting. Morgan was saying that this was a kind of thing that he wasn't going to play along with, and he was going to gamble that the popularity of it was going to be good enough. But I'm not even sure in the long run that he even cared that much about it. This is just who he was, and he wasn't going to be a hypocrite about it, and he wasn't going to change who he was. So he's got a reputation, and that reputation stays with him throughout radio, and it follows him into TV. So one of the reasons why we're going to say that he is one of the forgotten or overlooked people in television is because his transition to TV was quite a bit different from how other stars transitioned. Whereas somebody like a Gary Moore was hired specifically to bring his radio persona over to TV. Morgan was a commodity where they wanted his audience, they wanted his popularity, but they didn't want his difficulty. So he was going to have to come over with some certain conditions. You couldn't take it away completely, otherwise he wouldn't be Morgan. But he was going to have to learn how to play by the rules a little more. And because of that, it wasn't as smooth or as effective a translation to go from radio to television as it would have been from some people. And because of that, he never had the same popularity or dominance, if you will, in TV than he did in radio. It's why he wasn't famous as being a host on TV. He was famous for being a panelist, especially on I've Got a Secret, or some of his occasional appearances on What's My Line, or he was on That Was the Week That Was, where he wasn't the host. He was the panelist. He was in a much more confined environment than he would have been as the host. He had much less freedom, but it was enough freedom to allow his personality to shine through and to show what kind of guy he was, why people did like Henry Morgan.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned That Was the Week That Was, because I was thinking that when you were doing your impression of him, that was like sort of 20 years ahead of what would come on That Was the Week That Was,
Mm-hmm.
Laugh-In, or the Smothers Brothers, where you had this sardonic thing where they would take sometimes pseudo commercial breaks, sometimes real commercial breaks, but they were doing that, and he was doing that 20-some years before on radio.
Well, and one of the other things that if you look at the career of Bob Crane, for instance, his pre-Hogan's Heroes career, where he was one of the most successful and most popular DJs on the radio, you can, I think, see how Crane picked up some of this sensibility, his interactions with commercials, Godfrey's interactions with commercials, where you can see that the role of the commercial spokesman changes. Neither Godfrey nor Crane were as sardonic, satirical about the product as Morgan was, but it was there. It was going off script. It was doing your own thing. And I think that Morgan was certainly one of the forerunners in that type, not only that type of satirizing the product, but that type of humor in general.
So one of the interesting things, just looking it up, that apparently on his radio shows, Henry Morgan's sidekick was a fellow named Arnold Stang. He was, I guess, sort of the Ed McMahon to the Johnny Carson of Morgan. And the only thing I really know Arnold Stang from was apparently he did the voice of Top Cat, and he was also one of the gas station guys in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, in the scene where Jonathan Winters just totally obliterates a whole gas station. He's one of the attendants that's annihilated.
Yeah. And Arnold Stang was also a sidekick on the Milton Berle show at one time too.
So what was his role versus Morgan? Was Morgan the straight man and Stang the comic foil?
Yeah, he fit in very much to the role of the announcer in radio at that point in time. And it's, it's very interesting to look at that too, as to how announcers became stars in their own right. We mentioned in the Gary Moore show that he started out as one of the announcers for Arthur Godfrey. And you have Don Amici, who was the announcer on uh, uh, ventriloquist.
Yeah, I know. Jerry Mahoney.
No, not Winchell and Mahoney, but it was the one before that.
Yeah, I know who you mean. I can't.
Yeah,
Think
and I knew about it when I started this sentence, but that's here today and gone to lunch. Charlie McCarthy, Edgar Bergen.
Okay, yeah, right.
And so the announcer was often a foil, a punchline. I think Kenny Delmar was also a favorite announcer on some of the shows before he got into a lot of voice work with like Foghorn Leghorn. But the role of the announcer and the role that this is being fulfilled is that he's partly like George Fenneman was with Groucho. He is there to keep the show going, but he's also there to play a particular role, whether it is a role in the skits or as the foil or as the the straight man or the opposite of the straight man. And I think that when you look at Morgan, he's a perfect guy to have in a situation like that, because he's going to be reacting to a lot of things. So somebody like Don Wilson or Dennis Day, when they were on the Jack Benny show, you're going to have Arnold Stang saying and doing certain things that are going to allow Morgan to reply to them in the way that Morgan needs to be set up to reply. So yeah, I think that when you look at that, it's so much a product of its time on radio and early television. Again, Durwood Kirby. I could sit here and just name off Second Bananas and announcers, but the fact is that the announcer was a critical part of the show in radio and in early television. And so it's no surprise that we not only talk about the announcers, but we see so many of them becoming personalities in their own right. And so many times we talk about how so-and-so got his start in radio and he worked as an announcer before he graduated to having his own show, because these people were well known and they were very popular with the audience. So when they would come on and do their commercials, often as part of the show itself.
Interesting piece of trivia. When you mentioned Edgar Bergen, I thought of the Homecoming Waltons original movie where Edgar Bergen played the grandpa, and he and the family are gathered around the radio listening to Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. So he's listening to himself.
Isn't that great?
It was just a minor moment of breaking the fourth wall there. But back to
Morgan would have enjoyed that, I think.
Yeah. But back to Morgan, he was blacklisted. How did he get blacklisted? How did he get off the blacklist?
Let me page through my notes on this, because I do remember something about that. But I ought to post my show notes sometime just to see all the things that I've pulled up on here to show how much research that you and I do on these shows to get ready for them. What I jotted down here was that his was an indirect as opposed to a direct investigation. But you had this whole climate of scrutiny, during the McCarthy era, where everybody kind of came under a certain level of suspicion. And what his particular tag was, that he was politically unreliable. Now, I don't know how much of that came because of the reputation he was getting for being difficult to work with. I suspect actually a lot of it came from the ridicule he showed the sponsors, and the extension of that, the idea that this man is not a true capitalist. That's how these things work. There's a certain element of if you're against the product, there's something kind of vaguely anti-American about that. So I think that his satire as well, satirists often would come under that kind of suspicion. If you look, even somebody like Bob Hope, the comedian of presidents. Now, Hope was never blacklisted, but there were people who criticized Hope for making fun of the president, Eisenhower, and that was something you weren't supposed to do. And so I think that those were, more than any specific action that he took or association that he was involved in, those were the kinds of things that would draw the kind of attention that you didn't particularly want. And so, what was the effect of this? Well, obviously, it didn't last that long. But what did happen was that he didn't have as many opportunities on radio or television. The sponsors became a little gun shy. The networks became a little gun shy. Nobody wanted to engage in that kind of controversy. But he wasn't fully blacklisted because he was still a reliable performer. He was a witty writer. He was still popular. He was controversial, but he by no means was he universally disliked. And I think for him, this came at the right time because he was not a movie star, so he wasn't going to get kicked out of movies. Television was becoming the big thing. Television needed talent, and they couldn't afford to be quite as picky about things as either radio or the movies could. So he happened to be in a favorable position where, although they were leery about him in TV for many reasons, including this, they couldn't afford to be quite as picky about the talent as the other media were. And so in that sense, his talent and his availability outweighed the downside, the reservations they might have. And as that evolved, the primary reservation, which continued to dog him throughout the career, was that he wasn't really trusted as being that he wasn't going to go off script, that he wasn't going to be the team player, that he wasn't going to be the reliable shill that they wanted. That was where the trust level suffered, not so much anymore from the blacklist.
So 1952, he gets on I've Got a Secret. He's one of the four main panelists, and the interesting thing is when you look at especially the ones from the early to mid 50s, the first 3 or 4 seasons of that long-running show, it lasted a decade and a half. He's sort of the enfant terrible of that show, but if you look back on it, it's like, my God, I mean, he'd raise an eyebrow or wink at something that, and this would be like, oh my, did you get that double meaning there?
Well, that's it. He's very witty. He's very intelligent. If you ever read anything that he's written or listen to him in an interview, he's very well put together. And so he's able to do these subtleties on TV, especially in the early parts of I've Got a Secret, very well. But you remember I made a big deal about how Bill Cullen filled a role on I've Got a Secret. So did Morgan. Morgan was a perfect counterbalance to Gary Moore. Now, he and Moore were very good friends off screen. They had a terrific relationship, and that comes into play in the way that Morgan is able to succeed on I've Got a Secret, because Moore trusts him. He's going to give him more rope than a lot of hosts would. Knows him, trusts him, knows how far he'll let him go. But at the same time, Moore's not afraid to reel him in slightly. He'll deflect some line of inquiry or some tangent that Morgan may be ready to go off on. He'll deflect that, but he'll do it with humor, and he'll lead it into something else. So Moore is not showing him up. He's guiding him into a different area. On the flip side of that, Morgan has a great deal of respect for Moore. And so he's not going to push back on something like that for the most part. He knows that Moore's trusts him. He's going to play by the rules a little more, and he's not going to get his nose out of joint through something like that. Now, they also play off of each other on the show very well because Moore is warm, he's skilled, he's the guy who keeps everything going. Morgan is dry, he is the contrarian, the one who keeps the show from getting too saccharine or too sentimental. And he keeps things lively because he will go off format from time to time. So they work very well together. And his piece of the puzzle fits in very well with the other three panelists. Bess Meyerson is beautiful, she's glamorous, and she's a former Miss America. Bill Cullen, we've already talked about. Betsy Palmer can be a little ditzy at times, but she has that real friendship, relationship type of thing with the contestants that will serve her so well when she becomes a talk show host. So Morgan is a perfect piece to fit in there. Now, the other thing about Morgan is that because I've Got a Secret was live for most of its run, like so many of these shows were, not all of it, but most of it. So if Gary Moore was unavailable, if he was on vacation, and we've talked about Moore's workload, he was on TV a lot, and so he took vacations. The show didn't stop, or he'd be under the weather, or he'd be on another project. Henry Morgan was more or less the permanent guest host. And Moore had a lot to do with that because he trusted Morgan in the role. Morgan was not competition. Morgan was going to do the show differently from how Moore did. Morgan was going to be less sentimental, as I've said. He was going to be a bit more of his own personality coming through on the show. He was going to keep the show moving. But the important thing was that because Morgan was so experienced, having done live radio and live television, he was a good host to have if something unpredictable came up, if somebody said something that was surprising, or if they were having trouble with a particular guest. Morgan was a good guy to have in that position. So he's not as warm as a personality as Moore. He's not as polished as Moore, but he's a familiar face to the audience. He's part of the I've Got a Secret family. He knows how to manage the contestants. He knows how to handle his fellow panelists, and he knows how to think quickly on his feet on live TV. So he's a perfect person to fit into that role as long as you don't overdo it, and he didn't.
I can see him working well with Cullen and Moore. I'm wondering, though, with the sort of ditziness that you mentioned with Palmer, and I know Bess Meyerson in later years, she was involved in New York City politics. Mm-hmm. She was known to be very prickly and very demanding herself. I'm wondering if she and he got along.
Well, there's a famous story about he and Betsy Palmer that you actually can see play out on the live broadcast if you catch the episode on Buzzer or before that on Game Show Network. Traditionally, the panel was made up that you had Bill Cullen, then you had Bess Meyerson, then you had Henry Morgan, and then you had Betsy Palmer. Betsy had done something, said something, asked some kind of a question, and Morgan made it fairly obvious that he thought it was a stupid thing to say and a stupid thing to do. He didn't try to disguise it. He was only slightly subtle in it, but she reacts visibly to it. You can see her actually trying to hold back tears at one point during the remainder of the program. It's quite an astonishing thing to see on live television. And the next week, you see that they have changed the order of the panel entirely, so that now Betsy Palmer is next to Bill Cullen, and she doesn't sit next to Morgan for the rest of the run of the show. And They didn't directly, well, they didn't address it at all on the program, but to change the normal pattern of your guests on a panel show when they've sat the same order year after year after year is going to be fairly noticeable to the audience. Now Morgan says that he does not pretend that the incident never happened. And, if you dig into the history books a little bit, it's pretty easy to find some information about it. But he says they patched things up. They eventually reconciled. And if they weren't close friends, they did maintain a good working relationship. I think that Bess Meyerson was smarter than Betsy Palmer was. And I think that on that basis, the two of them would have had a better relationship simply because she wouldn't have been likely to trigger something that might have provoked some kind of a response from Morgan. But Morgan was the smartest guy on the panel. Let's say that Cullen was close to him in that. Cullen is trying to solve the puzzle, but Morgan is clearly got an intellect that he isn't afraid to display on there, and so the potential of ruffling anybody's feathers at any point in time is there.
So we've talked a lot about the game shows, so a lot of I think we can sort of move on from there, because I do want to talk about a couple of incidents that display some of this sort of aberrant behavior that probably would have gotten Morgan in trouble had he done it 20 or so years before. I'm looking here on the Wikipedia page, and they talk about two incidents a decade apart. 1972, when Morgan was a last-minute host sub for Merv Griffin's show, and he sort of lost his mind listening to the blatherings of the Spanish guitarist Charo. And then a decade later, he's on Late Night with David Letterman with Francis Ford Coppola, and instead of, I guess, interacting well with Coppola, he just started talking about his ex-wife, and during a commercial break, he just walked off the show. Now, it seems as he got older, he just gave less of a damn about anything.
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate, especially if you're doing a guest stint on a show. You don't have a regular thing. You don't have to worry about antagonizing the sponsors. About the worst thing that can happen to you is that you're not asked back on the show, and you may not be asked as a guest. And it's hard to say that that would have particularly bothered Morgan, but the thing about Charo is that you can't, in a sense, you can't blame Morgan for reacting the way he does, because that's like gasoline on a fire. It's getting dark here. I've been turning the light on because I have a window in front of me, and we've got some kind of a system clearly that is rolling in. So I can see it has gotten very dark in here. It's only 5:30 when we're doing this, but I'm having a little trouble myself right now. So I didn't want to appear to be like I was on lights out. Or
it was sort of giving you that Nosferatu look.
I'm gonna. It is later than you think, but I think that with both Charo and Coppola, what you've got is a situation where Morgan is kind of assuming, in part at least, the role of the audience, and whether. Especially with Charo, you had two choices with Charo. You either played along with the shtick, or you called it out. And I think that to ask Morgan to sit there through all this coochie stuff would have been just not. What are you asking me to do? That kind of thing.
And for people
I
who
don't think
don't
you
know,
can.
who are too young, Charo was this blonde bombshell from Spain who was originally a quite a good flamenco guitarist,
Mhm.
but after maybe a half a dozen TV appearances of that, people noticed she had luscious breasts and a pretty sexy body, and so all she did was go hoochie coochie hoochie coochie hoochie coochie.
Yeah, she was very popular on shows like Merv Griffin or The Tonight Show,
Yeah.
and that's because she'd get up and shake her booty to demonstrate a point. But you're right, she was at the same time a very skilled musician, and she was also married to Xavier Cugat, who
Mm.
used her as his band singer, and he kind of created the Charo persona that would sell very well. Now,
One of the few times that an old guy actually succeeded in promoting a young wife, see Pia Zadora for the Failures.
yes. Now, if you've ever seen Abby Lane perform on TV, and if you haven't, I suggest you do because it's a lot of fun. But Abby Lane was a very attractive singer, and she was previously married to Xavier Cugat and was his singer before they divorced, and he got Charo. So, if you want to make any pass on Xavier Cugat, you can probably ask yourself what kind of a man would dump Abby Lane for Charo. I don't know. Anyway,
So let me take a stab though as to why, because I'm looking at the career arc. In answer to the question of why he would have lost some notoriety, been forgotten, even though he shouldn't have for television, he does one of the oddest things that a television star who was on, I guess, at its top for a few years. I've Got a Secret was certainly a top 20, maybe even a top 10 show
mhm.
a couple of times. He retreats back to where he came from. He ends up going back to radio in New York City at a time when radio is just dying on the vine. This is the 1980s, early 90s, just before he died. The only way you succeed on television, even someone like a Wolfman Jack from 30 years earlier isn't going to succeed, is being a shock jock like Don Imus or Howard Stern. Henry Morgan, although he's witty and mordant, isn't the Howard Stern. He goes back to radio, and it's almost, you can almost think of it like a turtle retreating and retracting into its
Yeah.
shell. So what? It almost seems like he committed a slow career suicide.
Well, he even before that he was again like Bill Cullen. He was one of the rotating hosts on Monitor.
Hmm.
So he working on the weekends. He never really lost that desire to work on the radio, and I think that he found that there was a bit. He found it a bit more literate medium because he was talking directly to the listener at that point. And I remember he did commentaries, he did interviews, he did humor, he did the satire. He had more creative room to maneuver on the radio. Whether he was on Monitor or anything else, he had a little more leeway. He still had to be careful with the sponsors, but he had more of an ability, I think, to do the kind of thing he wanted to do. And one of the sources actually refers to this as a professional rehabilitation on his part, that by returning to radio, he kind of rehabilitated his reputation and his career. And so that the radio ultimately wasn't going to work for him either because you had less of a national radio presence. You had a lot of segmented radio. You'd come on and you'd do a 5-minute interview before the local news, but Monitor was the last show of its kind on the radio. And so even though he was a regular on there, it wasn't the kind of thing he was going to be able to do. And so what the irony is when you look at his career, the irony is that Morgan pioneered a particular form of entertainment, and yet he never was able to the time when that became much more established in TV is after he's gone. So he never really got to reap the treasures of what he had originally planted. I think that's interesting. I also wanted to do something just because we talked about the Merv Griffin thing, and I want to save our listeners having to, go out there and hunt it down. The whole bit with Merv Griffin is that Charo is on the show and he's trying to interview her, and she keeps interrupting him, and she has, keeps going on with this shtick about uh, she can't understand English very well. She understood it a lot better than she let on, but that was part of the Kugat inspired persona. And so what Morgan says is, you dragged me out of bed because you said you were stuck for a guest, and I have to sit and listen to this nonsensical babble. So nobody who would who knows about Morgan could possibly have been surprised by that kind of a response.
So we've done now, both in this Forgotten Remembered series, also in the series of influential television people. Of all the people that we've interviewed, when I've seen Morgan early on at the height of I've Got a Secret, he seemed, the Woody Allen phrase that comes to mind, or the term, is anhedonic. It's almost like he never could enjoy himself. He never seems to be totally happy on TV. There's always a look of restrained pain, like he's on a bed of nails. In later appearances, this seems to be even more so. On guest appearances on other shows that he would have talked, this seems to be true. On the few times when I've Googled and looked up Henry Morgan's clips from the 70s or 80s, it seems even more so. And it's not because he's aging or because he's dying of cancer. He seemed to be one of these people that never seemed to get what he really wanted. We've talked about Gary Moore's disappointment. We've talked about other people and their ups and downs. But Henry Morgan, not that he was a miserable SOB or something out to ruin other people's day, but he just seemed to sort of slowly stew in his own discontent.
I think, if I put my psychoanalysis hat on for a moment, I think Morgan's problem was that people didn't get what he was all about. Whether it's the satire or the commercials or anything like that, I think that he felt a certain amount of being confined to having to play a role he wasn't entirely comfortable with. I think he was frustrated by the idea that what we would probably refer to as the suits were constantly interfering with what he wanted to do, whether it was the commentary that he did or the types of ideas that he had. I think that it frustrated him to a certain extent. To what extent, I don't know, but it frustrated him that he did not have more freedom, and that the people who were making the decisions did not appreciate what he was all about. They didn't appreciate the satire. They didn't appreciate the commentary. They didn't appreciate what he brought to a show the way he thought that they could. And when you're a creative person, and I think Morgan was, with all the different things that he was creative. And when you are a creative individual and you feel that your creativity is not being appreciated, you have a tendency to think that it's because the people who do not appreciate it do not understand. Ergo, they're too dumb to appreciate what you're doing. If you don't get my comedy, it's because you're too stupid to understand it. And I think that Morgan was outspoken enough that he wasn't hesitant to express that opinion, whether he did it in words or body language, or again walking off the show with Charo or Coppola. I think that he had a very low tolerance for fools. He wasn't a patient man in some respects. He got along so well with Gary Moore because Moore respected him, and I think that he associated that lack of understanding of what he was trying to do, not only with perhaps a lack of intelligence, but with a lack of appreciation, a lack of understanding, a lack of willing to give him the opportunity to go along with that. And I think you see it with a lot of artists. They get a reputation for being temperamental or difficult to work with, oftentimes rightly so, but it's because they feel that they aren't being appreciated. They aren't being understood. And I think that made it difficult for him because he didn't feel like he was able to do what he wanted to do, and therefore he was self-limiting the appreciation that he could take from what he did accomplish.
The only career arc that I can think of that maybe resembles Morgan's a little bit, although probably not, I think of Buster Keaton. Now, Keaton was a much bigger star than Henry Morgan ever was back in the silent era, but he had a greater fall, and for 20 or 30 years after the end of the silent film era, he was living on crumbs. And then in the early 60s, there was a revival of appreciation for the silent era, and he got a bit of his due. He didn't have the money or the fame that he did, but he was recognized as an artist, someone who was maybe not as great as Chaplin or even maybe Harold Lloyd, but he was recognized as one of the foundational pillars of that art form.
TV had a lot to do with that too.
Yeah, and but Morgan, I don't think ever got that. So in whatever
No.
little way that this show can be, maybe if there is some afterlife and he's looking down,
Well, I think
at least
you
he
know,
knows that a
I'll
couple
just,
of guys 60 years later saw that.
I'll give a really quick personal example of my own that just that many years ago in another life form I ran for political office, and in order to win I found myself moderating what I said in public in some of the positions I took. Now it didn't help. I lost. And people would say to me, well, you lost, but you can't, you did a good job. You did better than most people would have in a situation like that. Think of it. You actually ran for office. But I looked at it and I said, but I can't be proud of it because I compromised myself. I would rather have lost by more votes and been more true to what I believed than to not be authentic and to come closer. And I think that's part of where Morgan's coming from, that he isn't authentic to himself in what he wants to do, and therefore he doesn't feel as if the success he has is earned. Maybe he can't see what other people see.
Yeah, and I think that's a good analogy, and that's a good way to end this. Next month we'll be back. I don't know what we'll do. Maybe we'll be doing something bigger. Maybe we won't. We'll see. But good talking with you as always, Mitch.
As always, here too, Dan. Thanks a lot.